September 1980. The border town of Khorramshahr. A wedding has just ended. The bride's hands are still marked with henna when the first artillery shells begin to fall. In the courtyard, abandoned tea glasses catch the last orange light of sunset. The smell of diesel and dust drifts in from the west. Someone drops a serving tray. The sound of metal on stone is swallowed by a deeper sound, the grinding of tank treads, still miles away but growing closer. Within 72 hours, this city will have a new name. The Iraqis will call it Khorramshahr, the city of blood. Years later, in the rubble of another city, someone will find a child's plastic key stamped with a symbol that opens nothing. In a few minutes, you will understand why 8 years of war produced no victor, only 1 million graves. This is the story history tried to file away as stalemate. Now, let us go back to the beginning. If you're interested in stories about the machinery of power hidden in official records, consider subscribing. In 1979, the world watched as the Shah of Iran fell. What replaced him was not another dictatorship wearing Western suits, but a revolution led by clerics in black robes. Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile in February. The airport footage shows an old man descending from an Air France jet, his face expressionless, crowds pressing against barriers to reach him. Within weeks, the American embassy was stormed. Diplomats were taken hostage. Television screens showed blindfolded Americans paraded before cameras, crowds in Tehran burning flags, chanting slogans that Western intelligence agencies struggled to translate. But the more unsettling footage never made it to evening news. The systematic purging of the Shah's military officer corps, the Revolutionary Guards appearing in every ministry, the trials conducted in school gymnasiums where generals who had once commanded divisions now stood before teenage clerks reading charges. Next door, in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein watched. He had recently consolidated his own power through a televised purge that resembled a theater performance. Members of Iraq's Ba'ath Party sat in an auditorium while Saddam himself read out names from a list. As each name was called, armed guards escorted the accused from the hall. Some wept, others walked silently. The remaining delegates rose and applauded. The applause was loud, sustained, captured on film. It was a test. Everyone understood what the applause meant. Saddam saw weakness across the border. Iran's new revolutionary government had systematically alienated its own military establishment. Pilots trained in the United States were now suspect. Generals educated in Western academies were being purged or executed. The Iranian Air Force, once considered among the best in the Middle East, was now led by clerics who distrusted the very men who knew how to fly the F-14 Tomcats and F-4 Phantoms the Shah had purchased. Diplomatic cables from the period, later declassified, reflect a consistent assessment. Iran's military cohesion had collapsed. But Saddam saw something more valuable than weakness. He saw land. The Shatt al-Arab waterway, the narrow channel where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet before flowing into the Persian Gulf, had been a source of territorial dispute for decades. Under a 1975 agreement, signed under pressure, Saddam would later claim, Iraq had conceded control of the waterway's midpoint to Iran. Now, with Iran in revolutionary chaos, Saddam believed he could reclaim it, not through negotiation, through invasion. There was also the matter of Khuzestan, the oil-rich southwestern province of Iran, home to a significant Arab population. Iraqi propaganda began referring to it as Arabistan. State media broadcast messages of liberation. "Come home," the broadcast said. "Your Arab brothers will free you from Persian oppression." The language was carefully chosen. This was not presented as conquest. This was marketed as reunification. On September 22, 1980, Iraqi forces crossed the border. not at one point, but along a front stretching hundreds of kilometers. The initial assault involved more than 200,000 troops, supported by armor, artillery, and airstrikes. Cities like Khorramshahr, Abadan, and Avaz came under immediate bombardment. In Baghdad, Saddam appeared on television wearing a military uniform he had never earned in combat. He spoke of swift victory. The campaign, he suggested, would be over within weeks. It would last 8 years. The first months resembled what military planners call a conventional war. Iraqi tanks advanced. Iranian forces, still reorganizing after the revolution, mounted a chaotic defense. Khorramshahr fell after weeks of brutal urban combat. The Iraqis discovered that taking a city was one thing. Holding it against a population that refused to surrender was another. Iranian fighters, many of them irregular forces, not professional soldiers, used buildings as cover, ambushing Iraqi patrols, disappearing into basements and sewers. The occupiers found themselves in a city that felt like a trap. Tehran's response was not what Baghdad expected. Instead of suing for peace, Ayatollah Khomeini declared the war a holy defense. The language shifted from national survival to religious duty. Young men were called not just to enlist, but to embrace martyrdom. The concept of martyrdom, deeply embedded in Shia tradition, became a recruitment tool. Posters appeared across Iran showing the faces of young soldiers beneath Quranic verses. The state media broadcast funeral processions that resembled celebrations. Mothers who lost sons were praised, their grief reframed as honor. This is where the war stopped resembling any conflict the modern world had recently seen. Iran began forming irregular volunteer militias known as the Basij. These were not professional soldiers. Many were teenagers, some were younger. They received minimal training, sometimes as little as a few weeks. They were given a plastic key stamped with the symbol of paradise to wear around their necks. The keys, they were told, would open the gates of heaven. The state distributed these keys by the thousands. They were manufactured in factories, packaged like prayer beads, handed out at recruitment centers alongside uniforms that often did not fit. By late 1981, the system was operating at industrial scale. In 1982, Iran launched its first major counteroffensive. The operation was called, without irony, Undeniable Victory. The strategy was simple in concept, horrifying in execution. Waves of Basij volunteers would advance across minefields to clear the way for regular troops. The Iraqis, observing this from their defensive positions, initially believed it was a suicide tactic meant to demoralize them. It was not a tactic, it was doctrine. Imagine standing behind a sandbag wall at night. You hear chanting before you see movement. The sound grows louder, thousands of voices reciting prayers in unison. Then the figures appear in the flare light. Not a dispersed skirmish line, but dense columns of young men moving forward together. You open fire. They keep coming. You fire again. Some fall. The rest continue. You realize that the bodies of the ones who fell are now marking the safe paths through the minefield for those following behind. You understand, in that moment, that this is not soldiers you are fighting. This is something else. Iraqi officers documented this in their reports with a clinical detachment that barely concealed their horror. One intelligence summary from 1983, later obtained by Western analysts, described Iranian human wave attacks as operationally effective despite extreme casualties. The phrasing is important. Effective. The tactic worked. It shattered Iraqi defensive lines. It also consumed an entire generation. Iran's leadership framed this not as waste, but as transcendence. State media broadcast footage of martyrs' funerals where crowds celebrated. Families received certificates of martyrdom. The government provided financial support. The mothers were given titles, Mother of a Martyr. that carried social prestige. The system turned grief into currency, loss into honor. And it worked, because the volunteers kept coming. Saddam, facing this reality, made a decision that would define the war's moral abyss. If Iran was willing to send waves of young men to die, Iraq would find a way to kill them more efficiently. In 1983, Iraqi forces began using chemical weapons. The first confirmed use was mustard gas, deployed against Iranian troops near Hajj Umran. The chemical, a relic of World War I, causes severe burns, blindness, and respiratory failure. It does not kill instantly. Victims suffer for hours, sometimes days. Medical records from Iranian field hospitals describe soldiers arriving with blistered skin, their lungs filling with fluid, unable to see or breathe without agony. Iran protested to the United Nations. The international community issued statements of concern. The chemical attacks continued. By 1984, Iraq had escalated to nerve agents, tabun and sarin. These are more sophisticated weapons, designed to kill quickly by disrupting the nervous system. A single drop on the skin can cause convulsions, paralysis, death within minutes. Iraqi artillery shells and aerial bombs delivered these agents across the front lines. Iranian soldiers began to carry atropine injectors, a partial antidote, though it was rarely enough. Photographs from the period show Iranian troops wearing improvised gas masks, cloth soaked in water, plastic bags held over faces with rubber bands. The images are surreal. This was modern warfare regressing to medieval desperation. The international response was muted. Western governments, particularly the United States, maintained relations with Iraq throughout this period. Diplomatic cables from the U.S. State Department acknowledged the chemical weapon use, but characterized it as regrettable rather than criminal. France continued selling Iraq advanced weaponry. The Soviet Union provided military advisors. The war had become a proxy stage where global powers wagered on outcomes while claiming neutrality. The bodies piling up in the desert were someone else's sons. No sanctions were imposed. No embargoes were enforced. The machinery of international trade continued without interruption. Here, at the center of the war, a realization crystallizes. This was not chaos. This was system. Both governments had discovered that their populations could be conditioned to accept limitless sacrifice. Iran used religious fervor. Iraq used nationalist pride combined with fear. Saddam's regime arrested families of soldiers who deserted. It publicized executions of traitors. It distributed ration cards that depended on continued military service. The Ba'ath Party machinery ensured that every neighborhood had informants, that every act of dissent was noted. Obedience was not requested, it was engineered. The Iranian system was equally comprehensive, but operated through different mechanisms. The Revolutionary Guards maintained files on every community. Mosque attendance was monitored. Families who showed insufficient enthusiasm for the war effort found themselves excluded from state benefits. Their children denied university admission. The concept of martyrdom culture was institutionalized through schools, where children as young as 6 learned songs about dying for the revolution. The conditioning began early and was reinforced constantly. By 1985, the war had settled into a grotesque rhythm. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. Neither side would accept defeat. The front lines barely moved. Soldiers lived in trenches that resembled those of World War I. Mud, rats, disease, the constant smell of decomposition. One Iraqi soldier's diary, later recovered by journalists, contains a single entry repeated for 19 consecutive days. Shelling at dawn. Ahmad is dead. We are still here. On the 20th day, the handwriting changes. Someone else has taken over the diary. Artillery exchanges continued daily, killing people without changing territory. Pilots flew missions that accomplished nothing except more destruction. The oil infrastructure of both nations burned. The economic capacity of both nations drained into the sand. Iran launched periodic offensives with names that promised divine intervention. Khaybar, Badr, Karbala. Each operation followed the same pattern: massive buildup, human wave assaults, Iraqi chemical weapon response, tens of thousands dead. A few kilometers of worthless desert gained, then lost, then gained again. After each offensive, both governments declared victory. The propaganda machines on both sides had become so proficient at reframing defeat that their populations no longer possessed the vocabulary to recognize failure. In 1987, the war expanded into the Persian Gulf. Both nations began attacking oil tankers to strangle each other's economy. The tanker war, as it became known, drew international intervention. The United States Navy began escorting Kuwaiti tankers reflagged with American colors. Soviet warships appeared in the Gulf for the first time in decades. The regional conflict was becoming a global risk. Still, the war on land continued. Still, young men walked into minefields. Still, chemical shells fell from the sky. The turning point was not a military victory. It was exhaustion. By 1988, both nations had depleted their treasuries, their armies, their population's willingness to endure. Iran's economy was collapsing. Iraqi debt had reached catastrophic levels. The casualties were beyond count. Hospitals in both countries had entire wards filled with young men whose lungs had been destroyed by chemical agents, who would spend the rest of their lives connected to oxygen tanks, whose suffering would outlast the war by decades. The end, when it came, arrived from an unexpected direction. July 3rd, 1988. The Persian Gulf. The USS Vincennes, an American cruiser operating in international waters, detected what its radar operators believed was an attacking Iranian fighter jet. The crew had seconds to decide. They fired. Iran Air Flight 655, a civilian Airbus A300 climbing on its regular scheduled route from Bandar Abbas to Dubai, disintegrated at 13,000 feet. All 290 passengers died. 66 were children. The youngest was 2 months old. The United States government initially defended the action as justified self-defense. Within days, the narrative shifted to tragic mistake. Years later, compensation was paid to the families. No criminal charges were ever filed. The crew of the Vincennes received combat action ribbons. The psychological impact on Iran's leadership was profound. The message, intended or not, was clear. The war had drawn in powers that could destroy Iranian civilian infrastructure with impunity. 1 week later, Ayatollah Khomeini accepted a UN-brokered ceasefire. His statement, broadcast on Iranian radio, compared the decision to drinking poison. The metaphor was apt. The war ended not with triumph, but with a bitter acknowledgement that continuation meant annihilation. The ceasefire took effect on August 20th, 1988. The borders remained where they had been in September 1980. The Shatt al-Arab waterway was still disputed. The territorial ambitions that had justified the invasion were unmet. Saddam had gained nothing. Iran had lost a generation but retained its revolutionary government. The official casualty figures varied wildly depending on who was counting. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 500,000. Other analyses suggested over 1 million. The number of wounded, displaced, and psychologically shattered was incalculable. What followed was not reconciliation, but erasure. Iraq's government began systematically downplaying the war's cost. State media pivoted to celebrating Saddam's defense of the Arab world, while omitting footage of chemical weapon use, of mass graves, of veterans whose bodies would never recover. In official Iraqi history, the war became a Qadisiyah, a reference to a 7th century Arab victory over Persia. The framing was deliberate. 8 years of stalemate transformed into mythological triumph. Iran took a different path, equally comprehensive. Sacred narrative replaced military history. Museums rose to honor the martyrs. Cemeteries transformed into pilgrimage sites, each grave marked with a photograph of a young face, most smiling, frozen forever at 17 or 19. Films, textbooks, monuments, the state produced a continuous stream of content reinforcing one story. The suffering had meaning. The sacrifice was necessary. The war defended Islam itself. Veterans who returned broken, families who lost everything, found their individual grief absorbed into collective memory. Their pain became public property. But documents tell a different story. Medical records from both countries reveal the long-term effects of chemical exposure, chronic respiratory diseases, cancers, neurological disorders. Entire cohorts of men would die prematurely in the decades following the war, their deaths never officially connected to their service. Birth defects in the children of exposed veterans appeared at rates far above normal. Neither government conducted comprehensive studies. Evidence scattered across hospital files was never compiled into a coherent record. The same bureaucracy that had mobilized millions for war proved suddenly incapable of documenting its aftermath. Financial records prove equally revealing. Iraq emerged from the war owing more than $80 billion, much of it to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. This debt would drive Saddam to invade Kuwait 2 years later, triggering the Gulf War. The Iran-Iraq War did not end in 1988. It metastasized. Iran's economy, crippled by 8 years of total war footing, would take decades to recover. The revolutionary government had promised a new Islamic society. Instead, it delivered poverty, unemployment, continued repression. The war had not strengthened the revolution. It had embalmed it. Then comes the silence in the archives. Entire categories of records were never released. Iraqi documents detailing chemical weapon acquisition and deployment remain classified or destroyed. Iranian military records from certain operations have vanished, particularly those involving Basij casualties. International observers who visited the front lines took notes that were later lost in bureaucratic transfers. UN inspectors documented chemical attacks, then watched their reports buried in procedural delays. The same machinery that orchestrated the war now worked to obscure it. But evidence survives. It always does. Archaeologists working in former battlefield areas continue to uncover mass graves. Forensic teams identify remains using dental records and personal effects: a watch, a Quran, a plastic key. Letters written by soldiers and smuggled out of the war zones have been preserved by families, now surfacing in academic collections. Satellite imagery from the 1980s, declassified decades later, shows the scale of trench warfare, the cratered landscapes, the burned oil fields. The photos do not lie. Survivors exist, though their testimonies complicate the official narratives. Many Iranian veterans speak publicly, but always within the state's martyrdom framework. Iraqi veterans who fled after Saddam's fall in 2003 tell different stories: confusion, fear, orders that made no tactical sense, commanders more afraid of Saddam than the enemy. They describe watching friends die for patches of desert abandoned the next week. They describe the smell of chemical weapons, sweet, sickly, unforgettable. Western diplomatic correspondence from the period has been partially declassified. The cables reveal cynical calculus. Support for Iraq was never about ideology, only containment. The fear that Iran's revolution would spread across the Middle East. Chemical weapons use was acknowledged in private memos, but never became a barrier to continued support. One cable from November 1983 describes Iraqi chemical attacks as a worrying development, but concludes that strategic interests outweigh these concerns. The language is bureaucratic. The meaning is clear. Some wars are tolerated because they serve larger purposes. The war left scars on the physical landscape that remain visible today. The marshlands of southern Iraq, once among the largest wetland ecosystems in the world, were deliberately drained by Saddam in the war's aftermath, partly to punish marsh Arabs who had sheltered Iranian forces. Satellite comparisons from 1980 and 2000 show the transformation. Vast blue areas turned to brown desert. Restoration efforts have partially succeeded, but the ecosystem will never fully recover. The land itself remembers. In Iran, certain border towns rebuilt after the war have a peculiar character. The architecture is uniform, planned, lifeless, the product of rapid reconstruction that prioritized function over memory. Walking through these streets, you see few buildings that predate 1988. The history was not preserved, it was paved over. Older residents, when asked, sometimes speak of what was lost, not just buildings, but entire social networks, families who moved away, businesses that never reopened, a sense of normalcy that never returned. The physical war ended in 1988. The psychological war continues. The children of that generation carry the legacy in ways they are only beginning to articulate. In Iran, the sons and daughters of martyrs form a distinct social class, recipients of state benefits, but also bearers of expectation. They are told their fathers were heroes. They grow up with absence framed as honor. Some embrace this identity. Others quietly reject it, a rejection that cannot be made public. In Iraq, the children of veterans who were exposed to chemical agents are now adults dealing with health issues whose origins they cannot fully prove. The documentation does not exist. The state that exposed their fathers to those weapons no longer exists. The responsibility has dissolved. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect is how quickly the world moved on. By the early 1990s, the Iran-Iraq War had been overshadowed by the Gulf War, then by the 9/11 attacks, then by the Iraq War, then by the Syrian Civil War. The 8-year conflict that consumed 1 million lives became a footnote, a regional war that never quite captured global attention the way other conflicts did. There are university students today who study Middle Eastern history and spend more time on the 6-day war, which lasted a week, than on this 8-year catastrophe. The silence is not accidental. It is structural. The question that remains is simpler than it appears. Why? Not, why did the war happen? That question has answers involving territorial disputes, revolutionary ideology, opportunistic aggression. The deeper question is, why did it continue? Why, after the first year when it became clear that neither side could win, did both governments keep sending people to die? Why did the international community watch two nations destroy themselves and intervene only to prevent one side from winning decisively? The answer is not written in any single document. It is distributed across thousands of decisions, each one logical within its own framework, each one contributing to an aggregate insanity. Saddam could not accept defeat without risking his own overthrow. Khomeini could not compromise without betraying the revolutionary principles that legitimized his rule. The clerics in Tehran needed the war to maintain their grip on power. The Ba'ath Party in Baghdad needed the war to justify its repression. The war became its own reason for existence, and the people, the soldiers, the families, the civilians, were trapped inside a machinery that had transformed their suffering into necessity. Every death was reframed as sacrifice. Every atrocity was justified as retaliation. Every continuation was presented as the only alternative to something worse. The system did not require evil people to function. It required ordinary people to accept extraordinary horror as normal procedure. This is what the plastic keys symbolized. Not faith, but the industrialization of martyrdom, the mass production of consent to die. This is what the chemical weapons revealed. Not merely war crimes, but the willingness of nations to deploy systematically what had once been considered beyond moral limits. This is what the 8 years demonstrated. Not the cruelty of war, but the capacity of systems, political, religious, bureaucratic, to sustain cruelty indefinitely. The Iran-Iraq War did not fail because of human weakness. It succeeded perfectly at what systems of power are designed to do, to perpetuate themselves. The cost was irrelevant. The outcome was irrelevant. What mattered was continuation. What mattered was control. What mattered was that the machinery kept running, even as it ground up everyone fed into it. Today, if you search for the war in official archives, you will find gaps. Pages removed, files unavailable, sections redacted for security reasons. The deletion was not an accident, it was policy. But you will also find the traces. The photograph of a soldier holding a plastic key. The testimony of a medic describing how chemical burns smell. The satellite image showing a minefield that has never been cleared. The medical report on a child born with birth defects 40 years after the war. These fragments do not answer all questions. They raise one. How many systems of power right now are producing horrors that will take decades to acknowledge, that will be obscured by bureaucratic language, that will be justified by the logic of their own perpetuation? The Iran-Iraq War is not history. It is a template. And somewhere, at this moment, someone is being handed a key and told it will open paradise. Someone else is signing an order that will be classified for 50 years. Someone is watching and saying nothing because silence has become procedure. The machinery is still running. It has only changed location.